Silent Hill 2 is definitely the most beloved and important game in my entire life. I finished it countless times with all of the endings, difficulties, and even some different languages. That's why it was only a matter of time when I decided to try and play it in its original language, Japanese. I've been studying it for the last 3 years, and my skill is now enough to go through the game almost without consulting a vocabulary. And as soon as I started it, I noticed a difference in the text between the English version and Japanese. That's when I decided to check the whole game for these nuances, and later make a video out of it. So, without further ado, let's dive into the Japanese version of Silent Hill 2. We begin with the iconic Mary's letter. Those few differences were the reason I decided to check the whole game for those and make a video out of it. Everyone knows these words.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill.
But in the original Japanese version, the used word aimai doesn't mean restless. It means vague, or I would even dare to say hazy, which would be thematically fitting, of course. Right after that, we've got those two lines.
You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did.
But in Japanese, it would sound differently. The direct translation would say, "You promised me we would go there someday again, but you couldn't do it because of me." So Mary is already highlighting the fact that they didn't go there because she fell ill. She blames herself for it, not James. And the last difference in the letter is very important, and we'll come back to it later. The phrase used for our special place can actually be translated like the place of our memories. And yes, our special place sounds really good, but the place of our memories kinda holds different meaning altogether.
Couldn't possibly be true.
After the letter is finished, James comments on that.
A dead person can't write a letter.
And it might just be me nitpicking, but the Japanese version says a different thing. You can't receive letters from dead people. But again, it might just be me.
Our special place.
James tells us that Mary died from that damn disease 3 years ago. There's no damn, no emotion in what he says in Japanese text. It's just she died from the disease 3 years ago. I think that's one of the things that were added to make characters' speech sound more American, which I'll mention a lot in this video. A little further, instead of "then why am I looking for her," James actually says, "then why did I come to meet her?" So James is not looking, he is sure she's there and wants to meet her. This whole town was our special place. And this is one of the reasons why I said that changing our special place to the place of our memories is important, since the Japanese version of this phrase says, "This whole town is full of our memories." The first difference that I noticed in the game itself, outside of cutscenes, is when James is inspecting the well and finds a red paper that allows us to save the game. The English version says, "Looking at this makes me feel like someone's groping around in my skull." But the Japanese word used for it, masaguru, can also mean tampering, so someone's tampering with my head. While it sounds less expressive, it definitely makes a lot of sense here. When meeting Angela, James doesn't really say "I'm lost" in Japanese. He says, "I wanted to ask you for directions." So then Angela replies with, "Directions?" And just a bit later she says, "I don't think you'll get lost," instead of "you can't miss it."
Yeah. It's hard to see with this fog, but there's only the one road. You can't miss it.
When Angela says "this town," there's something wrong with it. The Japanese text could be translated as "this town, it's strange now." And just after that, instead of short, "it's kind of hard to explain," the Japanese text gets the longer version that says, "I don't really know how to say it. I can't explain it very well." And I understand why the English version was cut, since it just sounds like Angela is repeating herself.
Maybe. And it's not just the fog either.
Then, when James says, "I don't really care if it's dangerous or not," the Japanese version says just, "I don't care if it's true or not," without even mentioning the danger.
I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going to town either way.
"I'd do anything if I can be with her again" would sound like, "If I can meet her again, I'll come to her no matter what."
Someone.
Who is it?
Someone very important to me. I'd do anything if I could be with her again.
When Angela says that she's looking for her mother, the Japanese version has one additional line saying that she hasn't found her yet. Even though we don't hear that in English voiceover, I guess it was cut since it's obvious that she hasn't found her mother yet.
I thought my father.
And when she mentions that she hasn't seen her for a long time, the Japanese text specifies that it's been years and not several months, for example.
I'm sorry.
That's the end for Angela's dialogue, and we venture into the town itself.
Yeah, you too.
This one I really like. When James finds the locked door in front of the apartment building, the writing beside it I personally find pretty obvious. Even as a kid I understood that waking in the darkness means that the door probably opens after dark. But the Japanese version specifically says that the door wakes not just in darkness, but at twilight. Yes, the town segment doesn't have any more differences, so we jump in straight to the apartment building, right to the clock puzzle. Here's how it sounds in English. 3 different sizes, time on the run, 3 young men circling around the sun. Henry is short and very slow. Scott can't stop, he's always on the go. Japanese version doesn't specify that those 3 are male, although it becomes obvious when you see the solution to the riddle. It also doesn't mention that Henry is short, it only lists the fact that he's the slowest one, so I guess the riddle already becomes easier to crack thanks to the localization. And Scott's description is pretty much the same, but it also mentions him being the fastest one, which makes the Japanese version of this easier to understand. I find it odd, but interesting, that one part of the riddle becomes easier with translation and the other one more difficult. Of course, when James sees the corpse in the chair, he doesn't say, "Oh my god," that's too English I would say. He just says, "That's horrible." When James is thinking if he should stick his hand into the hole in the butterfly room, the English version says that there's something on the other side of the hole. But the Japanese version only says that it's deep in the hole, which makes more sense I guess. And now one of those moments where the English version cuts whole sentences. The newspaper clip about Walter Sullivan that we find in trash. For some reason Japanese version specifies that Miriam and Billy Locane were killed in February. This information is absent in the English version. And another difference is the time when Walter killed himself. While the English version says he did it in the morning, the Japanese version says he did it at night. I suppose you could say that early morning is like 4 AM or something, but I still think that the night version sounds more plausible. According to English text, Walter's old schoolmate just said that he wasn't the type to kill kids. But the Japanese version, again, is more specific, and there he says that Walter was always calm at school and was generally a kind person, which is surprising. Later, when we find the Silent Hill pamphlet, it has one strange difference. If the English text says that the town has rows of quaint houses, the Japanese version says that these houses are ordinary. I guess different people appreciate different things, and simple houses are more attractive to Japanese people. When James finds Eddie and they have a really awkward conversation, there's an interesting moment. I don't know if it's an error or was it done intentionally, but James doesn't ask if Eddie is a friend of the Red Pyramid thing. He asks if that corpse in the kitchen belongs to one of those monsters, like that Red Pyramid thing. And I think that it actually makes more sense. And there's also a surprising thing. For once, Japanese is more articulate than English, since James doesn't just say this place. He basically calls it a dump.
I told you, I don't know.
There are differences in the coin puzzle, but there's already a good video that goes in detail about these differences. It's from TheGamingMuse, and I highly recommend it to you. I'll leave a link in the description of the video. When we find Angela again, James tries to discourage her from doing something with the knife. And if in English it sounds pretty natural, there's always another way, in Japanese it sounds more like better not do anything dangerous with it, which would sound stupid in English, so that's a really nice way to localize it. Later, when they speak about Angela looking for her mother, there's a difference in what she says after James says, "Is that right?" In English version, she tries to change the topic by saying I'm so tired, but in Japanese she actually answers with I don't know, which is a suiting answer for her. And later, when James says that this town is dangerous, in Japanese he says that the town is strange, just like she told him in the graveyard.
You afraid?
And before jumping straight to our first meeting with Maria, just a quick thing in dialogue with Laura that I really want to highlight. She doesn't say you didn't love Mary anyway. She says you hated her, and it might seem like a small difference, but I still think that not loving and hating are two completely different things.
None of your business. You didn't love Mary anyway.
So, when James meets Maria, instead of I can't believe it, in Japanese he says you are so alike. But that would be James repeating himself, so I understand why they changed that when translating the game to English. And then he adds, you could be her twin. But that's a really cool way to translate it, since in Japanese it's just plain, you are really like her. And when he mentions the differences between Mary and Maria, he says that those are her clothes and hair. But the Japanese version specifically says that he means the hair color. When Maria finally reacts to that, in Japanese version she says that she's not Mary's ghost, not just I don't look like a ghost, do I? And now my favorite part of this dialogue, that is changed because it says place of our memories in Mary's letter. When James mentions the hotel being their special place, her reaction is, so the hotel was your special place, huh? I bet it was. But this innuendo sounds even cooler in Japanese version, with special place being changed to place of our memories. It could be translated like that. So, memories of a hotel? I wonder what those could be. I absolutely adore this moment. When Maria joins us and we are trying to find a way to reach the hotel, we could pass by Silent Hill Historical Society that will play a role later in the game. And it's not actually a difference, but just a thing that I wanted to highlight. So, the correct way to translate it from Japanese would be Silent Hill Historical Archive. But since these kind of places are called specifically historical societies in America, it's localized as correctly as it could be. I would really want to say the iconic phrase about eating pizza is something different in Japanese, but sadly it's not. But there's a couple of differences in this dialogue nevertheless. Instead of calling Eddie just a gutless fatso, in Japanese Laura also manages to call him boring. And once again, when mentioning the apartment building in front of Eddie, our Japanese James can't contain himself and calls it a dump. When we arrive at the hospital and shuffle through patient files, one of them mentions that a patient has been involved in numerous assault cases, as well as battery and other violent offenses. But in Japanese version, there are specific numbers. 4 assault cases and 3 cases of other offenses. I don't know why would they simplify this while translating the game. Later, when Maria decides to lie down since she's feeling unwell, she blames hangover for it. But once again, the translation is simplified, and the Japanese version tells specifically that she was drinking for 2 days straight. I guess that's what happened right before her story in Born from a Wish starts. And just several seconds later, when she's already lying on the bed, she's making a gesture with a hand and simply comments that the bed is comfy. But the more accurate translation from Japanese is, the bed is white. And I guess these words and a hand gesture are an invitation to join her, which is completely omitted in the English version. And one more thing that could just be me nitpicking, but while James promises to come back to Maria as soon as he can, in Japanese he promises to return to Maria when he finds Laura. So he decided to do it himself without making Maria help him and letting her rest as much as possible. The diary on the roof of the hospital has several differences. On 9th of May, instead of English versions staring in the window all day, it just says, was lost in my own thoughts. And instead of still can't go outside, in Japanese version it says, I can't go outside because nothing has changed. The next page sounds pretty weird in Japanese. The English version is pretty logical with its would they have saved me if I had no family to feed. But then the Japanese text says, would they have saved me if I wasn't a sad person? So yeah, this time I'm on English version side. It makes more sense, even though it adds to the lore the fact that this patient had a family to feed, even though there's not a word on that in the original text. Laura is calling Eddie a big fat blabbermouth, but in Japanese version she says that chatty pig.
You know my name?
I think both versions are good, just choose what you like more.
Eddie told me.
That big fat
Now this one is special.
gonna yell at me if I don't.
No.
Here's the thing, there's no yell in Japanese text, there's only slap. She's asking if James is going to slap her. And I guess it was a wise decision to change it to yell in Western versions, since that wouldn't really be acceptable there. But I guess for a Japanese audience, that's okay. Another nitpicky moment. When guiding James, Laura says that she needs to get something. In Japanese version, it's more vague. She just tells that she needs to go somewhere. And when we arrive to the boss room, Laura says that Mary's letter is in the desk. It's changed for some reason, since the Japanese text says that it's in the closet, probably the big one that we see on the left. Later, when we meet Maria in the basement of Alternate Hospital, she says one of the most emotional phrases in the entire
All you care
game.
about is that dead wife of yours. I've never been so scared in my whole life.
And I want to applaud Jeremy Blaustein, since it sounds really meh in Japanese version. The accurate translation of that phrase from Japanese would be, I almost cried because I almost died. It rhymes, I guess, but actually sounds terrible.
You're supposed to take care of me.
The end of She is an angel note is also changed for some reason. While in English version it just ends with once again saying that she's an angel, in original it's chaotically repeating the last word, saving, several times. So it sounds more like a rambling of a madman. And the last one for the hospital is the scene where James is trying to open the elevator door and let Maria in. This is one of those cases where the Japanese version is more emotional, since James manages to say shit, which is absent in English localization. There's actually nothing to talk about in the next few sections of the game. And the only difference that I could find before we meet Maria again is on one phrase Eddie says in the prison cutscene.
Eddie, you can't just kill someone because of the way they looked at you.
Oh yeah? Why not?
Again, both versions of Eddie's reply are good, but I like the Japanese one, which can literally be translated as, isn't that a reason enough? Which one do you think is better? When James meets Maria again, there's quite a few differences in what they say to each other. When James asks her if she's hurt, she replies with just, not at all, silly. But in Japanese text, she explains that she's absolutely fine because she runs fast. I'm not sure how that would help her in that hallway, but okay, I guess. And instead of mentioning the blood everywhere, James just asks, what happened to your wound?
It chased us to the elevator, and then...
James, what are you talking about?
In the cutscene, when Maria mentions the hotel, and James being shocked just says Maria, in Japanese subtitles he actually asks her what she is talking about.
Maria?
Instead of I'm not your Mary, Maria says I'm not real Mary, which is a strange way to put it, but it might be a hint to her not being real at all. Instead of demanding an answer from Maria, James says, that's not what I want to hear.
All I want from you is an answer.
And instead of
I'm here for you,
iconic,
James. See? I'm real.
Maria is being more specific and says, I'm a live being. That doesn't sound really good, so I understand why it was changed to I'm real. And when Maria asks James if he wants to touch her, while our English James, being unsure, says, I don't know, Japanese James says yes, which is a big difference, I guess. That's a wrap for this scene. And the next point of interest is the newspaper we find before meeting Angela again. The first thing that is interesting, we get to know the age of Angela's father. He was 39 years old when he was murdered. In Japanese version, we only see the last digit of his age, 9, so he could be 49, 59 and so on. Also, for some reason, while English version simply mentions multiple stab wounds on his body, Japanese text specifically says that there was 4 wounds. When mentioning previous crimes of Thomas Orozco, we only get to know about him being drunk and violent from time to time. But the Japanese text also mentions him being an addict, previously charged for usage and possession. English text omits that. There are just two slight differences in our dialogue with Angela right after the boss fight. First being the fact that Angela doesn't call James a pig, she calls him trash. But a pig is a really suiting word, considering she just blamed him for only wanting one thing from her. And when Angela talks about Mary, the only thing James can say is, "That's ridiculous, I would never." But in Japanese version, he just says, "What do you mean, Angela?" Which is a less emotional reply to such allegations. Now it's time for my favorite part of this analysis, the dialogue with Eddie, cause it's mostly a bunch of cool insults. First difference is Eddie's "he always busted my balls." Unfortunately, the Japanese text here isn't interesting at all. It just says, "That's what he said." "You disgusting piece of shit. You make me sick." That's cool, but it's not as cool as Japanese version that says, "You were born from pig's ass. You are pig shit. Fat ass. You are nothing but a waste of skin." Once again, a nice translation of a more dull Japanese version. "I don't want to see your oily body or your stupid fat face. You're so ugly, even your mama doesn't love you." I guess Japanese people don't like your mama jokes, since it sounds completely different in Japanese. It can be roughly translated as, "Even your existence makes me suffer. Go back home, you sour garbage." Maybe I am a fat, disgusting pig. Now here Eddie just showers himself with insults, saying I'm an idiot, stupid, fat coward. Smart, dumb, ugly, pretty. Here the Japanese text is a lot more concise. It just says it doesn't matter if you are smart or fit, without any comparisons. And the corpse can't laugh. The Japanese text stays more on theme, continuing with, "Then you are the same as the fatso." When we get to the main refrigerator, Eddie tells us about his life, but once again, Japanese version is a lot shorter and less emotional, as it says, "Do you know how it feels to always lower your head?"
When you're hated, picked on, spit on, just because of the way you look, it tried to chew its own guts out.
Instead of all these brutal details, Eddie just tries to justify his actions by saying that the dog also laughed at him, which makes him even more insane in our eyes. Once again, less brutal descriptions. Japanese version only says that after shooting someone who came after the dog, that person tried to run away squealing. He cried more than the dog. Here the Japanese text says he was trembling so he could barely talk. English version is a lot more brutal than this, which makes Eddie's insanity more palpable. Instead of saying Eddie that he needs help, James just asks him to stop. And lastly, when Eddie says we are not like other people, Japanese text is a lot more interesting. It says, "You and I are the same. Don't pretend to be a good person."
Let's party!
So, the next few differences that we're going to talk about are in Mary's letter to Laura. Here's another example of cutting out a whole sentence, where in English text it just says, "Be well, Laura." In Japanese, there's also another sentence right before it, "I won't be back anymore." When Mary describes James, it looks like that. It's true, he may be a little surly sometimes, and he doesn't laugh much, but underneath, he's really a sweet person. In Japanese, she also mentions him being hot-tempered, and in the last sentence of this part, she tells Laura that she can ask James if she needs anything. And at the end of the letter, there's no "your friend forever," it's just Mary in Japanese. There's nothing really interesting until the scene when James learns the truth and Laura comes to him at this exact moment. She urges him to go look for Mary, saying, "If not, then let's go already." If you translate the Japanese version directly, it says, "There's no time to rest." When James says, "Mary's gone," the Japanese text sounds more dramatic, but not really suitable. We won't be able to meet her. And instead of calling James a killer, Laura just calls him a fool. When she says, "I knew it, you didn't care about her," once again the Japanese text is more dramatic, saying, "Did you hate her so much? Was she a burden to you?" And instead of saying "I hate you," Laura just calls James a fool several times. So when we get the Japanese voiceover in the remake, it will be just baka baka baka. How do you feel about the Japanese voiceover in the future remake? Tell me in the comments. I find it not suitable and interesting at the same time. And I really like the Japanese Mary's voice. There's just one small difference left in this scene. Instead of Mary you know, James says Mary you're looking for. There's one thing I want to mention regarding the dialogue between James and the doctor. When in English version he says, "How can you just let her die?" In Japanese it's more like, "What do you mean you can't do anything?" The English version is better in my opinion. It has more emotion. And speaking of emotions, it's time for our last scene with Angela. When she says, "Maybe then I can rest." The Japanese version sounds like, "Maybe then I can finally be happy." That's a big difference in my humble opinion. A really small one that doesn't really change anything is when she says, "Even Mama said it." In Japanese it's, "Even Mama knew it. I deserved what happened." The Japanese text says, "Because that's what kind of a person I am." And it's a brilliant way to translate it to English, since abuse victims are prone to blaming themselves for every bad thing that happens to them. When Angela bombards James with uncomfortable questions, it sounds a lot different. Here's how it sounds in English.
Or maybe you think you can save me. Will you love me? Take care of me? Heal all my pain?
And here's what it sounds like in Japanese if translated directly. Or will you help me? Always protect me, always support me, forgive me, and just love me. You could argue these are kinda the same, but I think that phrasing is really important here.
James, give me back that knife.
And that's where we say goodbye to Angela and go to the cutscene before the double Pyramid Head boss fight.
Stop! Leave her alone! Leave us both the hell alone!
In Japanese it's more like, "Stop, that's enough." I guess it's highlighting the fact that they killed Maria 2 times already. And instead of just emotional, "Leave us both the hell alone," James asks, "How many times will you make me suffer?"
I was weak. That's why I needed you.
Here's another interesting phrasing in Japanese. "That's why I wished you into existence." So it tells us directly that James created Maria and Pyramid Head himself. And instead of, "But that's all over now," James specifically says, "But I don't need you anymore. I know the truth, and now it's time to end this." If translated from Japanese it would sound like, "I understood it, and now I'll end this myself." There are two differences in the emotional dialogue between James and Mary in the last long hallway.
Brought you some
Here they are.
Flowers? I don't want any damn flowers. Just go
In
home.
Japanese it is phrased more complicated. "You brought flowers for me, being so disgusting?" And the second one is pretty big. In English it's just, "Look, I'm disgusting." But the Japanese text says, "Even when I looked at myself in the mirror, I shuddered."
Get the hell out of here.
And now I want to discuss differences that I found in the scenes before the last boss and endings before we go to the last and probably the most changed part of the main game, Final Mary's Letter. I usually finish the game with the in water ending, so that's what I'm going to start from.
But I can be yours.
When Maria says,
I'll be here for you forever. And I'll never yell at you or make you feel bad.
the last part is different in Japanese.
That's what you
It says,
wanted.
"I won't be a burden to you." Later, when James says, "I understand," the Japanese text is more specific, as James says, "I remembered it all."
No, James.
In this scene before the Maria ending, there are two differences. Instead of saying, "I was a burden to you," in Japanese Mary says, "I did a terrible thing to you."
You needed this Maria person?
Once again, the Japanese text is more direct, saying, "That's why you created this, Maria?" There are no more differences in other versions of this scene, so let's find out what's different about the scene where James visits Mary after the last fight.
That you didn't want to die.
The in-water version of this scene has one difference.
The truth is, part of me hated you for taking away my life.
You killed me.
Here, the second part is a bit different in Japanese. It directly says, "And it would be better if you were dead." And before James meets his fate, he says,
Now I understand.
the Japanese text once again reads, "I remembered everything again."
I wonder, what was I afraid of?
When James is visiting Mary before the live ending, she says,
Please. Please do something for me.
in Japanese it's more interesting. She says, "Can I say one last selfish thing?" And instead of telling James to go on with his life, in Japanese Mary just says, "Don't die." And the last ending that has two differences is Rebirth.
Without you, I just can't go on. I can't live without you, Mary.
In Japanese it's more poetic, saying, "I can't bear the sadness of being without you, Mary." And instead of, "I can't live without you, Mary," in Japanese it's just "I need you," which is less poetic. That's all for the endings, and now it's time for Mary's final letter, and it has a lot of differences between the languages. When Mary says,
I know I've done a terrible thing to you. Something you'll never forgive me for.
it's kinda different in Japanese, saying something like, "I know that my unforgivable sin hurt you, and that's my punishment."
I wish I could change that. But I can't.
In Japanese it's, "But I can't change nor reality, neither dreams."
I feel so pathetic and ugly laying here.
It's completely different in Japanese text. "I always wait and pray for you to come visit me."
Every day I stare up at the cracks in the ceiling, and all I can think about is how unfair it all is.
It's not as emotional here in the original, saying, "I lay on my bed, staring at the unchanging ceiling and always thinking about that."
Even so, I'm glad to be coming home. I've missed you terribly.
Here the second part of the sentence just says, "That hasn't changed."
But I'm afraid, James. I'm afraid you don't really want me to come home.
In Japanese these two sentences are just one question. But are you happy about me coming back home?
I don't know if you hate me or pity me. Or maybe I just disgust you.
In Japanese it's three questions. Do you hate me? Do you alienate from me? Do you despise me?
I'm sorry about that.
In Japanese it's, "There's nothing I can do about it."
When I first learned that I was going to die, I just didn't want to accept it.
In Japanese text it's longer. "When I learned that I have no future, I ran away from it, wanting to live, not wanting to die."
I was so angry all the time, and I struck out at everyone I loved most. Especially you, James.
I cried and screamed that I don't want to die, and in my anger I hurt you.
That's why I understand if you do hate me.
In Japanese it repeats the same three words used before. That's why it's understandable if you do hate me, despise me, if you're disgusted by me.
But I want you to know this, James. I'll always love you.
In Japanese it's, but since it's my last chance, here's what I want to write. I love you.
Even though our life together had to end like this, I still wouldn't trade it for the world. We had some wonderful years together.
The Japanese version of this says, even though this is what happened to me, these years when we were together, I was really happy.
Well, this letter's gone on too long.
In Japanese, it's once again a lot longer. I'm sorry that this letter is endless, since I'm just putting into words everything that I can think of.
I can't tell you to remember me, but I can't bear for you to forget me.
Probably the most heartbreaking part of this letter sounds a bit different in Japanese. I won't ask you to remember me, but I can't ask you to forget me.
I'm so sorry for what I did to you.
In Japanese it's more interesting, saying, I'm so sorry that I put these shackles on you. And that's the end of this beautiful game, but not for this video. I also want to cover Maria's scenario. Now, Born from a Wish understandably has a lot less differences in localization than the main game, but I decided to still include it here. The first difference is in the intro cutscene. Instead of emotional phrases like, I'm scared to die and I'm so afraid of pain, here's what she says. I don't think I want to die. I don't want to experience pain and suffering. So Maria probably was already thinking about dying, long before we see her putting the revolver to her head. But she changed her mind, deciding to fight and not just give in to the monsters roaming around the town. And now we are jumping straight to Maria's first encounter with Ernest, when he says,
Stop it. You're disturbing me.
The Japanese version provides a more detailed phrasing. This word, mimisawari, can be translated as nuisance for ears, so he basically says, this sound irritates me. Soon after that, Maria says this to Ernest.
I just want to see another human face.
But the Japanese text kinda has another meaning. She says, at least show me your face then. Instead of just wanting to see a human face, she asks Ernest if he doesn't want to let her in to at least show his face. But, as we all know, he ignores her request. When Maria asks Ernest,
You want to be alone in this insane asylum?
it's not as interesting in Japanese version. She just asks, do you want to be alone in this crazy town? Now, there are two differences in the main puzzle of Maria's scenario, the Greystone puzzle. Here's how it begins in English. Along with you died joy. All that remains is despair and the future of meaningless tomorrows. And here's how it reads in Japanese. There's only despair left, no hope, along with the tears that never dry. The last part is unchanged, it's future of meaningless tomorrows too. And the last sentence of this puzzle is also different. In English it's, but until my dreams return to reality, I will have to swallow all the pain. In Japanese it uses the word memories instead of dreams, so it sounds like, but until my memories return to reality, I will just have to breathe. And the last difference is in the final conversation with Ernest. When Maria doesn't let Ernest finish a sentence, she says,
Anyway, that's just what you think. You don't really know anything.
but in Japanese it's written in a strange way. That's just your crazy idea, not my future. And that's all for this video. Hope you liked this deep dive into the Silent Hill 2 localization as much as I did. And if you want to see videos like this about other parts of the series, or maybe even some other games, tell me about it in the comments. Goodbye for now.